You start.
The person I'll be interviewing today is William Martin. He was born September 13th, 1938. He served in the U.S. Army a few months before the Vietnam War. He is a first lieutenant. The day date and place this is being taken place is May 27th, 2016 in Kentwood, Michigan. I am Jillian Higgy, and I'll be conducting the interview, and the relationship to the interviewer is he is my grandfather. The interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library at Congress. So, where and when were you born?
I was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1938, September of 1938.
Can you tell me a little bit about your family? How many siblings do you have, etc.?
Sure. I have two sisters. My mother and dad were married in 1937, and my mother died after my dad died in about 1991. So they lived together about 60 years.
It's impressive. What were you doing before you entered the service?
I was going to college.
Okay.
So I had entered the Air Force ROTC when I was a freshman at the University of Detroit. As I got closer to the end of my sophomore year, I kept asking the people in the ROTC office, will I be able to fly?
Okay.
And everyone said, oh, yes, yes, Cadet Martin, you certainly will. Well, then I got to the point of taking my physical so that I could become a junior in ROTC, Air Force ROTC. And they said, oh, you're blind as a bat, and so you can't fly, and you'd be lucky to make navigator school. So I said, well, it was a time when the Berlin Wall was, the Berlin crisis was around, all sorts of things were going on, and the U.S. government was drafting everybody.
Okay.
And I didn't want to be drafted. So I went on and joined the Army ROTC, who brought me in. And I stayed in the junior, pre-senior, and senior year ROTC. And when I graduated, I was commissioned a second lieutenant. And that was in the first part of December of 1961. And so I packed up my bags and all my school stuff and left school after getting my diploma, and I went home. And I was at home for 3 weeks before I got my notice to report to Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland the first week in January of 1961.
How did your family take the news that you were going to be leaving?
They knew I was an officer, and so they knew I was going to get relatively good training and that kind of stuff. And so they were proud of me.
Okay.
They were proud that I was serving in the Army. They were proud that I thought enough of the country to join the Army, become a serviceman, give 2 years to the Army.
So after you had left, where did you go for basic training, or like what had happened after you had left?
Well, in ROTC, you spent 6 weeks in the summer between your either junior and senior, or what I had was 5 years of school, so it was between my pre-senior and senior year, I spent 6 weeks at Fort Riley, Kansas, chasing mosquitoes and you know, learning to be a soldier.
Mm-hmm.
You know, making your bed really tight. You know, all sorts of dumb things. You know, bouncing a quarter off of the sheets and, you know, so what?
So were you?
When I showed up for my 2 years of service, I took a train from Chicago to Baltimore, and it was an overnight train, and in the middle of the night the train hit a snowstorm and froze up. Got a little cold. So we finally got into Washington, got into Baltimore, and then I had to take a train from Baltimore to Aberdeen. So I took the train, got off the train, was met by a bus and brought into the basic indoctrination training was January through March. And then they trained you for what they called a military occupational specialty, MOS. And so I was out of a school where all of the people went to ordnance and all of the people learned to become ordnance officers. And so I went through the whole secondary program through June. In June, I got orders to report to a laboratory right on Aberdeen Proving Grounds. So I went to what is called the U.S. Army Human Engineering Laboratories. Now, we don't remake humans. We did, no. But we did learn about how to make a soldier's life easier, how to design equipment for a range of people from the 5th percentile person to the 95th percentile person. So we learned about that. And then I was assigned as a project engineer on a missile program, Army missile, and I served my 2 years. And when my 2 years was up, I had been offered a position in at Fort Riley, Kansas, with or I think that's where it was, but it was with the 24th Infantry Division, which was the 1st Infantry Division assigned to Vietnam. At the time, I thought, what the heck, this is a good job.
Yeah.
Good life. So I wanted to, but my wife of 6 months really didn't want to go to Kansas, and she didn't want me in the service. So I applied for and got a civilian job and stayed on right there. I just changed clothes, you know, from the Army greens to civilian clothes. I stayed there, about 18 months. So I worked a total of about 3 years at the United States Army Human Engineering Labs. During that 3-year period, my wife's mother died in Chicago, and my wife was the oldest of 6. And so she felt it necessary that she needed to be much closer to Chicago. So we started looking for a job, and I found a job here in Grand Rapids at the then Lear Ziegler Corporation, and due to, I don't know what, paperwork problems, whatever, I never, after I left the Army, I never had to serve again. But one of the young officers that I was serving with had graduated from West Point and was just totally gung-ho. He left the human engineering labs and reported to Fort Rucker, Alabama, which was at the time, and I think still is, the helicopter pilot training area. He was training, his helicopter went down and he was killed. That really affected me in that, A, I lost a friend, B, here was a guy that was really dedicated to the country, and we were just getting into the midst of the Vietnam War. And it really was just so very, very disheartening. I was sad about that one. When I moved to Grand Rapids, I was still kind of, I don't know, wet behind the ears, naive about the world. But of course I wouldn't admit it as a 26-year-old. No. So what I did was, I started paying attention to the news. And I paid attention, and all of a sudden, well, it really happened during the Democratic Convention riots in '68 in Chicago. I really became, the war seemed to me not to make sense. And it seemed like it wasn't the place we should be losing American lives. And so I was a little bit vocal about it, but not as brave as other people who stood up and carried signs and that kind of stuff. When I moved here to Grand Rapids, it was a time when I could grow as a person and, learn how to do lots of things. So my Army experience, while short, was very, how should I say it, very meaningful. I made some good friends. I lost a couple good friends. And it made me grow up, which was important. Because you can't be a 21-year-old wet behind the ear engineer and not grow up. You can't stay there. So what's the next question, my dear?
When you moved back to Grand Rapids, what did you do, after you moved here?
After I moved here, My wife and I tried to have children. We lost 3. And then there was about a 10-year period when she never got pregnant. And during this time, I was a project engineer, and then I became a section head. Section head meaning I had about 5 or 6 engineers reporting to me. And about 10 years down the road, after 10 years at Lear Siegler, I became a department manager. So I had 4 section heads reporting to me, about 40 people. It was mainly the soft side of engineering. We predicted how long equipment would last, and that was called reliability engineering. We selected all of the components, the little resistors and capacitors and that, which were used in the equipment in the 60s, but you wouldn't even know it existed today. Sorry. We then tested the equipment in the environmental lab, and we would test it over a range of temperature, very broad range of temperature, minus 54 degrees C and to up to 71 degrees C positive, so an 120 degrees C range. We tested, and then the other section was a material selection, the chemistry, the different kinds of materials that we could get to use in our products. And so I stayed there for 34 years. And when I left, I went on to work initially it was Rapistan, and then it became Siemens Dematic, and then it became Siemens. So it was a different job, but it was a good job, 7 years of controlling drawings, so it was nice.
When you were an engineer, what do you remember making or doing when you were an engineer?
Well, most of the stuff that I did as an engineer was to predict the life of the equipment, to test and assure that equipment could meet the military standards, and make sure that the parts that we used in the equipment all were capable of meeting military requirements. So it was more of a overseer's kind of a job. And you know, if you knew that it would last supposedly this long, well, then you had to use these kind of parts and these kind of materials to make it last that long. And then once you got a product, you tested it. So that's what I was doing.
You were testing products?
Yes.
What were you exactly testing?
At the time, Lear Siegler was noted for its attitude indicators, which is the attitude of an airplane. We had really interesting fuel instruments that were on tape. Everything else had been always a round dial, and the cockpits were just filled with these round dials. And so we could put 8 different tapes of instrument tapes in a very small box and clear up. area in the cockpit designed for more useful things. So we did that. And then as the design process and the growth of Lear Siegler, we got into Loran navigation equipment. We designed computers for that. And then we started designing what is called the performance data computer for the 727, now 737, but airplanes. And this was the one that managed all of the multiple fuel usage situations that an airplane gets into. And it combined the management of the fuel with the precision of navigation. And so what we designed was a computer that stored all of the Jepson airplane maps. All of that data was digitized, and we stored all of that data. We stored all of the performance data from the engine manufacturers and computers, and we combined that so that we could save fuel, time to flight. We could save, at the time we were saving 3 or 4% per airplane. And so when you figure that, a company may have 135 or 40 airplanes, 150 airplanes, and you're saving 3% of 150 airplanes fuel, that's a significant amount of savings. Then the thing was, we allowed them to navigate much more accurately. We could put an airplane, we could predict an airplane's time of arrival within minutes, within a minute, really. And this, of course, because